When you hear medieval peasant, what comes to mind? Be honest. Probably a tired, barefoot guy in rags, trudging through ankle-deep mud, starving, covered in filth, maybe coughing into a sack of potatoes, if he's lucky. A life so bleak, so miserable, it almost feels like punishment. But here's the thing. That image? It's wrong. Wildly wrong. And honestly, it's time we stopped buying into it. Because the Middle Ages weren't just some 1,000-year stretch of darkness, disease, and dumb decisions. They were a time of survival. Yes, but also of structure, routine, adaptation, and even joy. Not every village was a wasteland. Not every peasant was clueless. And definitely, not everyone was just waiting around to get hit by a catapult or accused of sorcery. Forget the cartoonish cliches. Medieval life was complicated. People had skills, rhythms, priorities. And every single day, from sunrise to sunset, they were moving, making, building, planting, cooking, praying, arguing, storytelling, and surviving in a world that was as real and as structured as our own. They weren't frozen in time. They were living through it. You want to know what medieval people actually did all day? How they worked, ate, loved, raised kids, fixed roofs, lit fires, told stories, and fought off boredom without electricity, smartphones, or even matches. Good, because that's exactly what we're about to explore. So hit that like button if you're tired of the same dusty old tropes, and smash subscribe if you're ready to trade in the myths for the real medieval daily grind. This isn't just history, it's humanity in its rawest, most resilient form. And it all begins with the sun creeping over a thatched roof, and a peasant stretching awake in a bed of straw. Let's go back in time. There were no alarms, no clocks, no 5 more minutes. In the medieval world, the sun was your schedule. The moment that first light crept over the fields, life was already in motion. Before anyone even thought about breakfast, there was work to be done. The fire had to be stoked, often from embers saved overnight, because without it, there'd be no heat, no cooking, and no protection. Someone had to walk to the stream or the village well and carry heavy buckets of water, sometimes more than a mile each way. And the animals? Chickens, pigs, cows, all needed tending before the family could sit down to eat. This wasn't optional. It was survival. Every morning started with duty, and every moment of light was precious. And if you think that sounds exhausting, just wait. Because the day was only beginning. Let's follow them through a full medieval day, hour by brutal hour. Forget what you've heard. Medieval people weren't walking plagues of dirt and grime. Sure, they didn't have toothpaste or hot showers, but that doesn't mean hygiene was ignored. Every morning started with a rinse, face, hands, even teeth. Peasants used ash or crushed herbs to scrub their mouths, and yes, they actually cared how they smelled. A clean face and clean hands weren't luxuries. They were signs of respect, discipline, and health. After that, food. A quick, hearty breakfast, usually dark bread, maybe a little barley porridge, and for adults, even a cup of ale or weak beer. Not for fun, because the water wasn't always safe. It filled the belly and fueled the labor ahead. But not all tables looked the same. The poor ate for survival. The rich, they ate for power. Different meals, different worlds. And what happened next would take the rest of their strength. Farming in medieval times wasn't just a job. It was survival, obligation, and identity all rolled into one. As the sun climbed higher, peasants were already deep in the soil, wielding wooden plows pulled by oxen, slicing through the earth with iron-tipped spades, cutting stalks with curved sickles, and hacking through weeds with heavy hoes. These tools weren't fancy, but in the right hands, they fed entire communities. But here's the catch. Most peasants didn't just farm their own tiny plots. They were also legally bound to work the Lord's land. That meant double the labor, often for half the reward. You sowed, harvested, hauled manure, and fixed broken tools, all under the weight of duty. Every season brought a new rhythm. Spring meant sowing. Summer brought weeding and watching. Autumn was all about harvesting. And winter, repairs, muck clearing, and praying for next year's yield. And after all that, your day still wasn't done. Ready to see what came next? Let's dig in. While peasants were turning soil in the fields, towns pulsed with the rhythm of craft and trade. The air echoed with the clang of blacksmiths, the hiss of hot iron meeting water, and the thud of hammers shaping wood. Cobblers stitched worn leather. Weavers worked looms in dusty corners. Bakers rose before dawn to fill streets with the scent of fresh bread. These weren't just jobs. They were lifelines, passed down through families, guarded by guilds. Guilds weren't clubs. They were power. A blacksmith didn't work alone. He had apprentices, journeymen, and strict rules to follow. To sell on the market, you needed their approval. Skills meant status. And in a crowded medieval town, reputation was everything. Markets buzzed with shouting merchants and clinking coins. Some still traded goods for goods, but more often, silver talked. Want flour? Bring wool. Want spices? Bring silver. The city never slept, and neither did its workers. Forget the cliché of medieval women quietly sewing by the fire. In reality, they were everywhere, working, managing, producing, and surviving. At dawn, while men headed to the fields, women were already hauling water, lighting fires, feeding animals, and grinding grain by hand with heavy stone querns. And that was just the start. A typical day included baking bread, spinning wool, weaving cloth, and tending gardens full of herbs and vegetables. These weren't hobbies. They were essential to survival. In rural villages, women joined men in the fields, planting, weeding, harvesting. Children strapped to their backs, skirts soaked in mud. They worked until their hands cracked. But in towns, the story shifted. Widows often stepped into their late husbands' businesses. Urban women brewed and sold ale, ran inns, traded fabrics, stitched clothes, and even practiced midwifery or basic medicine. In places like London or Bruges, women could be listed as official members of trade guilds or take apprentices of their own. Some even went to court to defend contracts or sue for unpaid debts. They weren't just helpers. They were workers, managers, and in many cases, providers. Their labor kept the household alive and the economy moving. And yet, we're only scratching the surface. What happened when the workday ended? Let's find out. But before we do, if you're learning something new, hit that like button and subscribe. There's so much more to uncover. If you think childhood in the Middle Ages was all about carefree games and chasing chickens around the yard, think again. For most kids, especially in farming villages, childhood ended the moment they could carry a bucket or hold a tool. By the age of 6 or 7, they were considered small adults, expected to work, contribute, and learn fast. Boys followed their fathers into the fields, blacksmith shops, or fishing boats. They watched, copied, and slowly took on tasks, learning to plow, to mend, to make. Girls stuck close to their mothers, mastering the rhythm of domestic life, kneading dough, spinning wool, feeding livestock, and eventually managing entire households. There were no school bells ringing in peasant villages. Education came through doing. Reading and writing? That was for the sons of nobles or clergy. Wealthy families hired tutors, or sent boys to monasteries or cathedral schools where they studied Latin, scripture, and arithmetic. But for the vast majority, letters were a mystery, and the only curriculum was survival. Even play, when it happened, echoed real life. Children made dolls from cloth scraps, wooden swords, or simple clay figures. Some games taught coordination or mimicked adult roles. It wasn't just fun, it was preparation. Because in the medieval world, the line between child and worker was thin, and growing up meant stepping into a role early. In medieval life, even lunch told a story about who you were. For peasants, the midday meal wasn't some relaxing break under the shade of a tree. It was a quick, practical pause, squeezed in between hauling tools or chasing stubborn livestock. A hunk of coarse bread, maybe a bit of cheese or salted pork if they were lucky, and a mug of watered-down ale. That was lunch. Often eaten with calloused hands, while standing, leaning on a shovel, or sitting on a rock in the field. But just a few miles away, at the manor, things looked very different. Nobles didn't eat to survive. They ate to impress. Midday feasts could last hours, with roasted game, honeyed fruits, and steaming pies, all laid out on long tables for lords, ladies, and their endless line of guests. Silver goblets, carved platters, servants constantly refilling your cup. And that wasn't even the biggest meal of the day. But status wasn't the only thing that shaped what was on the plate. The church played a massive role in everyone's diet. There were strict fasting days, sometimes over 100 a year, where meat, dairy, and eggs were off the table. Fish replaced pork. Grains and vegetables took center stage. Even nobles had to bow to these rules, though they often found creative ways around them. Eel pie, anyone? Food in the Middle Ages wasn't just about hunger. It was about survival, social order, and spiritual discipline, all served 3 times a day if you were lucky. In the medieval world, religion wasn't just something you believed. It was something you lived. Every single day, from the moment people opened their eyes to the moment they drifted off under rough wool blankets, faith was woven into the rhythm of life. Mornings began not with rushing or chores, but with whispered prayers, asking for protection, for good weather, for enough bread to last the week. Before meals, hands folded. Before bed, voices rose again in quiet thanks or pleading hope. But prayer was just the beginning. Church services weren't optional. They were expected. Sundays weren't for rest. They were for pews, sermons, and scripture. On holy days and feast days, entire villages paused work and gathered to mark events on the sacred calendar. Christmas wasn't a single morning. It stretched into days of celebration. Lent wasn't a suggestion. It was 40 days of sacrifice, reflection, and meals stripped of indulgence. Even the passage of time bowed to faith. Weeks revolved around Sundays. Years bent around saints' days, fasts, and festivals. Bells rang not just for the hour, but to remind people when to pray, when to stop working, when to gather. Religion wasn't one part of life. It was the framework that held everything else in place. In a world of uncertainty and survival, belief gave structure, meaning, and just enough hope to face whatever came next. Life in medieval Europe wasn't just about surviving the seasons, it was about surviving the system. And at the heart of that system stood your lord. If you were a peasant, your life wasn't fully your own. You owed more than loyalty. You owed your time, your labor, and your future. It started with tribute. Every harvest, a portion of your grain, eggs, or livestock went straight to the manor. Not as a gift, but as obligation. Then came corvée labor, days spent plowing your lord's fields instead of your own, or hauling stones for a road you'd never travel. If a noble needed a new church or mill built, you helped build it. If a castle wall needed repairs before winter, you were there with a shovel in your hands. And when war came, some peasants, especially those with more land or in closer service, were called to arms. Not trained soldiers, but farmers with spears, marching under banners they didn't choose. This wasn't a democracy. It was a hierarchy built like a staircase. Lords above you, kings above them. You couldn't climb it. You just hoped the step above didn't crush you. Every peasant lived under the shadow of this feudal order. The duties weren't negotiable. They were inherited, enforced, and expected. And saying no wasn't an option. Contrary to the tired old myth, medieval life wasn't just endless labor and silent suffering. Even peasants, bound by the seasons and the Lord's demands, carved out moments of joy. And when they did, the entire village felt it. Free time wasn't scheduled. It was seized. After the harvest or on holy days, people gathered for laughter, music, and games. Picture a group of villagers around a crackling fire, passing around a jug of weak ale, clapping along to fiddles and wooden drums. They sang folk songs that hadn't been written down, but lived for generations. They danced, told stories, and played. Games like Nine Men's Morris, handball, or even an early form of chess filled quiet evenings. Some took part in cockfights, crude, brutal, but wildly popular. Others watched traveling performers juggle, play flutes, or act out religious tales in village squares. For the wealthier classes, leisure looked different. Lords hosted hunting parties, falconry events, and grand tournaments with armored knights clashing on horseback. It was spectacle, and sport rolled into one. Fairs were a highlight for everyone, peasants and nobles alike. They offered rare goods, street performers, and even puppet shows. And for those with deeper faith, pilgrimages mixed devotion with travel and excitement, as entire communities walked for days to reach distant shrines. In a world ruled by obligation, these moments were pure gold. Getting sick in the Middle Ages was more than a personal crisis. It was a community event. And with no real understanding of germs, bacteria, or even basic sanitation, people leaned on a mix of tradition, belief, and sheer hope. Medicine wasn't practiced by doctors as we know them today. Instead, healing was handled by whoever had the most experience: local herbalists, village midwives, traveling barber surgeons, or monks who studied ancient texts in candlelit monastery libraries. Treatments blended natural remedies with spiritual rituals. A sore throat might be treated with boiled sage and vinegar, but also with a whispered prayer and a sign of the cross. Honey, garlic, and nettles were go-to ingredients, praised as much for their spiritual purity as their healing power. For serious illness, people turned to monasteries. Monks kept herb gardens with mint, rosemary, and yarrow, crafting poultices and teas passed down through generations. Midwives delivered babies with nothing but instinct, linen, and centuries of local knowledge. But when plague or fever swept through the village, things changed fast. Streets were rarely cleaned, animals roamed freely, and waste often ended up in nearby rivers. Epidemics didn't just spread, they exploded. People didn't know how or why, so they blamed bad air, sin, or divine punishment. And yet, somehow, they endured. Through faith, resilience, and a deep connection to the land, medieval communities faced sickness head-on, with grit, herbs, and whatever hope they could find. When we picture medieval homes, it's easy to imagine cold, dark huts with nothing but straw on the floor. But daily life inside these homes, whether a peasant's cottage or a knight's manor, was more complex than it seems. The average peasant house was small, often just one room shared by the entire family, and sometimes the livestock. Walls were made of wattle and daub, interwoven sticks coated with mud and straw. The roof? Usually thatch, which kept rain out but invited mice in. Smoke from the central fire curled up into the rafters, because chimneys were rare. Windows, if any, were tiny and unglazed, just openings covered with cloth or wooden shutters. The hearth was the heart of the home. It was used for cooking, heating, and lighting, usually burning peat, sticks, or dried dung if wood was scarce. There was no furniture in the modern sense. A rough table, a few stools, maybe a wooden chest, or a rope bed stuffed with straw. Light came from the fire, or oil lamps, and scent came from whatever herbs were hung in the rafters to dry. Now contrast that with a knight's home. In a manor house or castle, rooms were divided, walls were thicker, and floors might be stone or covered with rushes. A grand hearth stood in the main hall, surrounded by tapestries for warmth. Furniture was carved, often decorated. But even then, no glass windows yet, and heating was still a challenge. Whether rich or poor, people constantly repaired their homes. Thatched roofs needed replacing every few years. Walls had to be patched after storms. It was never a finished product. It was always being mended, adapted, and lived in, one fire at a time. As the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows stretched across the village, the medieval world began to slow. Fields emptied, streets quieted, and smoke curled from chimney holes as fires were stoked back to life. This was the hour when everything shifted inward, toward the hearth, toward family, and toward the rhythm of daily reflection. Dinner wasn't elaborate, but it was important. Maybe a warm bowl of barley stew with onions and bits of salted pork, or a thick slice of rye bread dipped in broth. Food was humble, but it filled the belly. As they ate, family members shared what the day had brought: the broken plow, the stolen chicken, the neighbor's new baby, or the strange shape in the clouds that looked like a dragon. After the meal came the quiet work: mending torn clothes, retying ropes, sweeping the packed earth floor. Every task done by firelight, every moment pulled closer together. Kids might sit cross-legged, listening wide-eyed as elders spun old tales of giants, saints, or foxes that outsmarted greedy kings. Songs were sung, not professional ballads, but rough, simple tunes passed down for generations. This wasn't just downtime. It was where identity was built, where lessons were taught, memories formed, and culture kept alive. The hearth wasn't just a source of heat. It was the center of medieval life. And as embers glowed into the night, people leaned in close, not just for warmth, but for connection. As darkness swallowed the last flickers of twilight, the medieval village braced itself for the unknown. Night wasn't just the end of the day. It was a time of deep vulnerability, when the world beyond the firelight felt wild and unpredictable. People didn't sleep like we do today. Most went to bed dressed, wrapped in wool or linen, with layers to fight off the cold. Beds were simple, just straw-stuffed mattresses, sometimes shared with siblings, children, or even farm animals. But here's the twist. Sleep often came in two parts. They called it first sleep and second sleep. After a few hours of early rest, many would wake naturally around midnight. Some prayed, others tended the fire, checked on livestock, or whispered quietly with family in the flickering dark before drifting off again. Villages took their nighttime security seriously. Gates were locked. Dogs patrolled yards and alleyways. Some towns had official night watchmen who walked the streets, lantern in hand, listening for trouble. People feared thieves, wolves, or worse, so protection wasn't optional. Before finally closing their eyes, almost everyone said a prayer. It was instinct, habit, fear, gratitude. They asked for safety, for peace, for another sunrise. Because in a world ruled by seasons, sickness, and uncertainty, even sleep was an act of faith. So, what did medieval people really do all day? They worked, prayed, built, cooked, sang, struggled, and survived. Not in silence or ignorance, but with rhythm, resilience, and purpose. Maybe not so different from us, after all.